And we are back. Welcome back to the King's Report this morning, Monday, November 6th, 2017. Second King reporting live from the Chenigung Palace to all the kings and queens of the Kingdom of God. And we are joined in the third hour by with Mr. Ford Fischer. He's the editor-in-chief at News to Share, a website he founded in 2013 along with fellow American university students. The website focuses on raw footage, live stream, and other multimedia content pertaining to activism. Thank you, Ford, for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been an interesting weekend, of course, for that subject.
Yeah, I mean, talking about an interesting weekend, boy, we have this Texas shooting that's, of course, the big news. Right. We have Donna Brazile throwing Hillary Clinton under the bus. We have the DNC really imploding the Civil War. We have Hollywood is just going down with the pedophile scandals and all the things that are going on there. And of course, we had the November 4th, the famous 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution and the quote Antifa revolution that was to begin. Can you covered that in Washington, D.C. Can you give us a lowdown on what happened in your experience?
Sure. So in Washington, D.C., of course, everybody was kind of going hysterical over this idea that November 4th, there'd be some kind of Antifa uprising, that there would be, people were in some media outlets predicting sort of mass casualty, violence as a result of anti-fascist protesters. And of course, that was predictably ridiculously overblown. Fox News is really the only outlet that is, I guess I would say, credible, that actually sort of pushed that narrative. They had a headline to the effect of like Antifa apocalypse inside the plans to, unseat the Trump regime, in quotes, or something like that. So other than Fox News, it was mostly smaller blogs that were perpetuating the idea that this was going to be some kind of gigantic situation. The part of the reason I think that people blew it out of proportion is that they didn't really understand where it had come from in the first place. So the organization that actually was trying to make something happen, right? It's not like nothing happened. Called Refuse Fascism, right? And so Refuse Fascism is just simply by the name, very, very easy to confuse with Antifa, right? Antifa is theoretically this kind of, one could say mob, one could say paramilitary group, although they tend not to be that organized or that well armed. But Antifa, right, is kind of this loosely organized group of people who are essentially who believe in using even violence to resist what they see as fascist policy or fascist activism and that sort of thing. By contrast, Refuse Fascism is an organization that probably believes in those similar ideals that I just described, but ideologically splits on what they actually do believe in, right? So they would both say we oppose fascism enough that that's the title of our organization, Anti-Fascist and Refuse Fascism. But while Antifa tend to have a more anarchist leaning, so among them you'd find ideologies of anarcho-socialism, of anarchist, communism, right? Of so-called libertarian socialism, if we'll ever figure out what that means.
Exactly right.
Right, but you'll find generally a mix of left-wing ideologies that even if it to most people who hear them, they think, oh, that would lead to statism, right? That it might be hard for someone to reconcile how you could have, anarchist communism or something. They would at least claim they're anti-authoritarian. Generally speaking, they would
claim that, right?
That they're anti-government, right? And they might say vote for Bernie Sanders, but they might also say, but in our ideal world, we could have, socialism without a government or something like that. That would be their ideology. On the opposite end, Refuse Fascism, the organization responsible for the November 4th activism, they are much more of openly state communists. So those are organizations, those are people, those are activists who would tell you that that Stalin may have been misguided in some of his implementation, but that he was right to try to put communism on a mass scale, that a nation should enforce communism, that that,
Right.
that Bernie Sanders is great, but he should also, eliminate voting so we can't lose the communism or the socialism or something. Right.
Right.
I don't want to try to speak for their ideology because I personally am quite the opposite. It's not something that is really in my area of expertise. But generally they believe in state imposed communism. And the reason that the distinction is important, right? It probably wouldn't be as important to make that distinction if these groups actually did unite. But in reality, they very much want to, or at least Antifa very much wants to distance themselves from refuse fascism. Refuse fascism has a reason to try to co-opt many other Antifa movements, right? Antifa was largely irrelevant, in the United States, at least until probably 2015, 2016, right? The first time I had heard of them was actually in reference to a Senate candidate who traveled to Canada to give a controversial speech, and Canadian Antifa were going to basically confront him. So, and that was in 2015. That was the first time I had ever heard of them. So now that they've become relevant, it makes sense for refuse fascism with a very similar name and with an ideology that has not a whole lot of difference that most people actually know about. Like, most people don't know the distinction that I just shared. It makes sense for them to kind of hijack that movement, to take advantage of Trumpism and kind of the resistance to Trumpism in order to get their own audience. So I've seen refuse fascism go to anti-fascist events or other left-wing protests, and then they hand out, what I usually proverbially call commie newspapers. But they actually have, I'm trying to remember the name of them, but basically like communist newspapers. I think one's called The Militant, things like that, right? So they try to pull street leftists, right? If somebody is kind of a casual, I guess, college socialist, right, you might be able to make them make that extra step into tanky, communism, right? If you give that guy the newspaper, right, and give them the free sign that says refusefascism.org. The final clarification that I would make on that is, while Antifa is kind of loosely knit, in some senses they wouldn't really want to be, they're anti-political, or they wouldn't want to be involved in politics because they're anarchists. Refuse fascism is essentially a front group for the Revolutionary Communist Party, right? So RCP is a political party that actually, puts out, of course, not successful, right? I don't know that they've actually gotten anybody into even in local offices, but they are actually a political party organization. The one refuse fascism character that I interviewed on Saturday showed me that he's actually a card-carrying member of the RCP, but he's also actually a member of the Democratic Party. He described that, in his opinion, the only way that he can move a mainstream party or move the actual state into communism is to sort of hold the Democrat Party to the left, because in his view they're closer to communism than republicanism, than the Republicans are, which is probably a fair determination, right? I'm not sure either of them would particularly be fond of being called close to communism, but in any event, he voted for Hillary Clinton, and he's in his view, he wants to push the Democrat Party in that direction.
Interesting. Now, you said taking that one step towards the statism or communism. Dinesh D'Souza described both fascism, or not anarchy, but anarchism, but fascism and or communism as sort of different grades on the spectrum of collectivism. Is Antifa, in your view, or through the interviews that you did with Refuse Fascism, do these various groups, of course, they're similar in their nature. They want to replace the republic. They want to replace democracies. They want to replace Western civilization with something else. What is it that they're seeking to replace it with, in your view?
Right. Yeah. So that question is essentially why precisely these are two different groups. And again, the issue is that someone like Fox News totally doesn't make that distinction, right? And I don't mean to, over criticize Fox News. I actually worked there for one semester in college, but like they called it an Antifa apocalypse. But all of the actual Antifa type people that I messaged, before this event saying, "Oh, are you going to be involved? Are you doing anything?" They were all distancing themselves from it. There's a
interesting,
a very prominent, outspoken woman in Antifa named Lacey McCauley, I think, or McAuliffe, something like that, in Washington, D.C., who a lot of people know for her role on Inauguration Day. She put out a statement saying, we absolutely condemn this. Actual Antifa is not participating, right? So part of the problem is that the media makes it sound like they're the same thing. The media doesn't sort of understand the difference. But to the important,
Right.
These
are all sort of competing different groups that are competing for their own audiences on own basis. Right. But they're pursuing a replacement to democracy, right?
Right. So
the Republican model, right?
What they're replacing it with is precisely why they are separate. So refuse fascism would replace it with something like what their political party, because again, they're a front for basically the Revolutionary Communist Party, what the RCP wants. Right. And so that would essentially be state communism. That would be the idea that they.
Oh, yes. The loving state communism.
They would have a president, and that president would, enforce communist policy, I suppose. So you'd have to basically just go on their website and try to read about it. I mean, that's something I could actually do. Revolutionary communist. I mean, it's probably a Google away. In any event, the Antifa are probably a lot less aligned with one another in terms of exactly what they would like to have instead of what they have now, because their essential unity is simply on opposing what they see as fascism, right? So they resist people like Richard Spencer, right? They resist people, like David Duke, whatever. Right. I filmed in Charlottesville. Right. So that was probably the most conflict I had seen with them. Probably the other time that I saw them sort of in a rather extreme conflict was on Inauguration Day. Right. So those two things would be on Inauguration Day, them fighting because of Trump. So they certainly see Trump as representing the kind of, fascism, right, as they see it. That they're opposing. And then they also see people who I guess they would say are sort of would-be fascists, or people who are spreading fascist ideology, but may not actually be in power. And in their view, there's sort of a sense of existential self-defense.
Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah. Now, in your research with refusefascism.org, we know it's very common, for example, that a lot of elites, including George Soros and different type of criminals such as himself, will create multiple fronts where they can, just in case one gets in legal trouble, they can funnel their money to other groups, and they're trying to pick and choose groups that they feel will, do violent revolution or will help them with their takeover or more consolidation of power in a particular nation. Is Refuse Fascism on the payroll of George Soros, Open Society Foundation? We know BLM is, we know Linda Sarsoris, we know that the Republican rhinos like Paul Ryan were on his payroll, connected to some of his top managers. We know obviously Hillary Clinton, he's the #1 donor. Is in your intel, is there any connection with refusefascism.org and the money from the Open Society Foundation?
Really, no, I mean they're not and I shouldn't say not really. No, I have no reason to think that. I mean, so my understanding is that while he is obviously would like to push America to the left, that he is not particularly fond of like communism, right, or kind of open, blatant, literal revolutionary communist party, that kind of thing. So no, I have no reason.
It's just too radical, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's radical. It's fringe, and it's not. I mean, I don't think it's particularly kind of in the Overton window, right? I'm sure that your audience would be familiar with the concept of the Overton window, but to say what I mean, the Overton window is basically this idea that politics might be in one spot, but the conversation around politics that's considered acceptable kind of moves around with it. So if you were in the 1960s or 50s and somebody said, I'm going to run for senator of Vermont and I'll do it as an independent and call myself a democratic socialist, that would be outside the Overton window. That would be considered basically unacceptable. It wouldn't be allowed in politics. But with the Overton window sort of shifting to the left or widening, right, it might become acceptable to call oneself a socialist. So at this point, I think, particularly with Sanders, we've moved the Overton window in America enough that it's okay to sort of say socialism, but still mainstream figures or people who are prominent tend to shy away from it, especially. Right?
Well, that was so amazing because Bernie Sanders was calling himself a democratic socialist, and he was literally, lauding, praising socialism. And you had all these young millennials that were like going out to vote for him. What, in your view, what was that kind of phenomena about?
Yeah, so I think that the Bernie Sanders phenomena was really interesting. I think that the part of the issue with it is that in kind of reality, while he was very, very far to the left, he probably did not actually espouse the views of what the literal definition of socialism is, right? Socialism is theoretically seizing the means of production. People take over the companies with the goal of essentially having social equity regardless of what they create, et cetera, right? Bernie Sanders probably was more of a social democrat, which is to say he wanted lots of government control and lots of free stuff. I did not hear him advocate the nationalization of industry or the seizure of the means of production, right? He didn't claim that the workers should own McDonald's or something, right? So in that sense, I think in a way that almost makes it more dangerous to those who see socialism as threatening. And the reason for that is that he espoused policies that were in the mainstream, right? That were kind of within the Overton window, saying, oh, the government should pay for everyone's health care. To some people sounds reasonable. Even Donald Trump at some point has said that sounds like a good idea, even though he backed away from it later. Everybody deserves free healthcare as a right. Everybody deserves this or that as a right. He's kind of twisted the word right to mean you're entitled to different services and stuff. And I think to some people, those things sounded reasonable. And then by attaching a word like socialism to it, then somebody says, okay, I guess I'm a socialist then, right? So I saw him on a few occasions where he said, oh, public infrastructure is socialism, right? So public roads are socialism, free healthcare is socialism, Medicaid is socialism, right? And they are socially funded for sure. And one could even say that within the context of those precise economies, they're funded in a socialist way. I guess there's communal owning of the roads, there's communal owning in a way of hospital services, but they do not represent that we in total at this point live in a socialist society. So I think he's trying to normalize it by saying, oh, we're kind of already there. Or we already have some aspects of this. Why don't we make that other step forward? So for young people, I think they especially kind of fell for it, right? Because one of the things he's offering, and this isn't the only reason that they were in favor of it, one of the things he's offering is we should have free college, right?
Yes, right, yeah.
So, free stuff, I guess, that applies directly to you is definitely appealing. And then when people contrast that to Mr. Trump, who also has some free things to offer, but they're not perhaps as enjoyable or as usable to the individual person, right? I can't.
Did we lose him? Okay, there he is. You're back forward. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I saw it said your connection is unstable, but Mr. Trump, right, is not offering things that young people particularly want, right? The wall would qualify as free stuff in a way. But it's not like that young voter is actually going to be able to enjoy the wall. The wall is not doing something for them. It's not a free sort of good or service. So I think young people ended up being very attracted to Bernie Sanders. And I think part of the other reason why he was attractive is that in spite of many extremely statist positions, I think in some ways he honeypotted young left-wing type people with positions that would actually be considered rather libertarian, such as he would claim that he is anti-war, such as claim, that he might legalize marijuana.
Marijuana, right?
In my view, and I'm not a historian, right? I film activism, but historically, I tend to agree with the quote, war is the health of the state, which is to say, if you're building a gigantic state and you promise that your state is going to be peaceful, that tends to run into issues, right? Nobody runs on the idea, hey, check out my ideology. I promise it'll be very violent and we'll start a war, right? Everybody claims that the ideology is one of peace, right? And so there's kind of been this pattern in America and elsewhere, run on peace, right? George W., of course, he had extreme circumstances that probably led to his hawkish positions, but he did lead on anti-nation building and conservative use of the military. And obviously he, started lots of wars. Obama runs on, we're going to be peaceful, progressive, shut down Guantanamo. None of those things happened. Donald Trump said that he was going to be non-interventionalist, not so much because he's the biggest humanitarian, but because war is expensive, right? If you're going to put America first, if you're going to have that kind of soft nationalistic attitude, then you shouldn't be spending money trying to solve other people's problems in the world.
We're like, how many places we are around the world? Like 150 or something. It's unbelievable.
Right, but he's already increased the rate of per day in office. He's launched more missile strikes than Obama did, right, on average. So he also, it's not like the state turned into kind of an anti-war state since he got in office either. So there's kind of this pattern, and I probably would see it being equivalent with growing government. I actually don't have any reason to think that Bernie Sanders would create less war, given that he wants to increase the size and scope of the state and its funding.
Right. Almost guaranteed.
Right. So it seems to me that these sorts of things, ending the drug war, ending the wars would come with, not funding them. So I think that I guess Rand Paul ideology probably makes the most sense with that respect. But for young people, just in terms of optics, who don't make that connection, who don't see it that way, I think that that's probably where far leftism attracted them, right? We want our money spent on these things that would actually help us, and we don't want these reckless foreign, engagements.
Well, the lure of free things is always a powerful temptation. We'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us, folks.
$6.58. $6.14. $6.46. Time 471.
Hello folks, I'm Justin Moon, the president of Car Firearms Group, and today I've got the PM40 with True Glow night sights, and look at that, Magna porting. Look at that porting on that. This is our standard PM40 with the day sights, but now this model with the Magna porting and the True Glow night sights. What a difference. The 40 caliber PMs have a reputation for being quite a bit of a kicker. They do kick a lot. And so we put the Magna porting on these PM40s, and boy, what a difference does that make. It really makes this PM40 shoot a lot softer, reduces the muzzle flip, the recoil comes straight back into you and becomes a very manageable pistol.
And we are back. Welcome back to the King's Report this Monday, November 6, 2017. We are joined with Ford Fischer today, political activist and, of course, multimedia content activist, filmer as well. I'm sorry, filmer.
Activism, I should say.
Yes. Thank you for that correction. Thank you, Ford, for that correction. Now, during the break, we were talking about the potential, or at least on the internet, some people are saying and showing pictures of the Texas shooter with an Antifa flag, and you have a particular view on that. Why don't you share that view?
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of people writing to that effect, and most of the outlets that I would consider reputable, if they're referencing at all, are calling it unfounded claims or that sort of thing. The reason that I think it's actually kind of interesting is that it's an example of how the internet and people in general, but it especially happens on the internet where people aren't kind of held personally accountable to their views or what they say. Whenever these mass casualty incidents happen, people rush to kind of politicize them for whatever ideology they like, or trying to condemn the ideology or thing they don't like, right? So when this shooting happened, yes, a lot of people have started posting about, well, he was wearing black. We found some kind of iconography that seems to indicate anti-fascism on his Facebook profile. Oh, he must have been, an Antifa type person, and that's why he murdered a bunch of people. First of all, the same thing happened with Vegas, right? And there's no credible reason to think that Stephen Paddock was in any way associated with Antifa either. But there does end up just being a lot of fake information in the fallout from this stuff. And I think it's interesting because it shows how America, in some ways, and I'm sure this could happen in other places abroad, but people tend to use their ideology to color their view of a mass tragedy kind of as soon as it happens, right? The bodies are still warm, and people are trying to attribute ideology to the attacker. And this happens on the left and the right. Where in this case, right wingers are saying, look, he's, he fits the mold of Antifa. Maybe he was one of those type of people. And of course, the left, always is very interested in the particular tool used to commit the act, right? The left will very, very quickly often say, look, if we had this rule, if we had this law, perhaps you wouldn't have had the firearms. If bump stocks were illegal, then perhaps the shooter wouldn't have been able to commit this or that atrocity, right? And it's interesting because it's like how, if you polled the people who are currently against gun stocks, right? Maybe let's say 50% of this country is currently in favor of banning bump stocks, right? And they would loosely fall among the left and maybe some in the center, right? If you polled all of those people 2 months ago, do you know what a bump stock is, right?
No clue.
I would guess that most of them would have no clue because they're not actually interested in having guns or gun accessories, right? And they're not attributed to some kind of a tragedy, right? I knew what a bump stock was before this stuff, but I've also fired, semi-automatic and automatic weapons recreationally, right? Mm-hmm. So I actually I've engaged with these tools and I understand what this stuff actually is. And of course, I'm not personally in favor of banning them. So it's interesting because when a tragedy happens, someone says, okay, let me look at this and then figure out how I can try to kind of control the situation. And I don't even think that always comes from a bad place. Somebody might on the left sincerely believe that, if we respond by banning the tools that the killer uses, then we're going to have less killings. On the right, somebody may sincerely believe if we ban a certain group of incomers into the country or a faith or something like that, that they also attribute to a killer, that they're making the world more safe in some way. But generally, I think that these instinctive reactions of trying to pin it onto something instead of pinning it onto a human being that has decided to take the lives of other human beings, it can kind of turn into dangerous politics. And when it's done too early, without actual fact, it can also just sometimes turn into wrong politics, right? At this point, I don't think we have a reason to think that Texas shooter was associated with Antifa, but it probably ends up discrediting the outlets that make that claim.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, and definitely, I would agree with majority of that statement, or your position there. Other than the fact that, and I think you probably agree with me, that human beings can be filled with ideologies, of course, with many different streams within them. But of course, that can become very dangerous as well. But you have some of the, Paul just Watson, for example, posting church shooter. Devin Kelly posted this on his Facebook page, but no word yet as to motive. So of course, he's saying that he doesn't know yet. But it's interesting to see some of those, some of the things that are coming out on the web. Now, you were in Charlottesville for the 3 days where the incidents happened there. And of course, you had the whole situation where you had all these FBI and CIA people. You had the main organizers that were literally working for Hillary Clinton. I guess in the last year and a half, they became radicalized and became white supremacists when they were working for Hillary Rodham Clinton's campaign. How was that whole situation in Charlottesville, in your view, and some of the funny business that happened after that with, the different people that started emerging, the different interviews they were having supposedly of people just randomly on the street, happened to be people who were working for main left political candidates. Some of them were former, CIA. I mean, how weird was that?
Yeah, so that sounded like a pretty loaded question, but let me try to, I guess, help tell a history of, what happened there. So I think what you're referring to, the main, I guess, political conversion, the main, I guess you could say, like, leftist, right, who turned into a white nationalist, I guess, is Jason Kessler, who participated in the Occupy Wall Street movement, which is mostly considered left-wing, although I actually had this conversation with someone yesterday. Occupy Wall Street, when you did not have that many objectives that were so different from the Tea Party, right? It was the left-wing and the right-wing kind of version. But those two groups probably could have joined forces on about 80% of issues, right? It was because
that would have been good
against cronyism, right? So I think it makes sense in some respect that somebody on the far left, right? So somebody in Occupy Wall Street could very easily kind of spin around, because if somebody is attracted to the far left as a solution to the issues, essentially they may be somebody who believes that, some kind of big authority can fix the problems of society. Okay, we've got this financial collapse and people are losing their jobs and their wealth. And then somebody gets to them, right? Maybe with a newspaper, right? And says, oh, you could, if you had socialism, then maybe everything would be better. And I don't know that Jason Kessler ever identified as a socialist, but it does sound like he was somewhere along the left in participating with Occupy. So I don't want to try to claim to know exactly how his political conversion took place. I do know that the Trayvon Martin shooting in some way influenced his thinking. And the same thing is true with Chris Cantwell, who is also sort of a notable figure there. But somehow he kind of horseshoed around into white nationalist ideas, believing in some kind of a large ethno-state, or the idea that there should be a big government. And it's funny because you can almost see that it would be that if you didn't know it was right-wing language, you'd actually think it's left-wing language kind of plus racism, right? So when you talk about Bernie Sandersism, it's, free stuff, right? Free college, whatever. In the case of some of the white nationalists, they would like a government that gives you like free segregation, right? Free separation, right? The free service of separating you from somebody who's different from you. And so in some ways,
So you're saying the white nationalists also want a big government that's providing, quote, the service of segregation.
yeah, I mean, they're national, right? So they're not really, I've heard a lot of people try to make the claim about the idea of like a libertarian to alt-right pipeline, right? The idea that somehow you go from one of those to the other. The only way that I see that happening, right, is if somebody was only in libertarianism in order to have kind of fringe ideas or just sort of be kind of on the edge of the Overton window or something like that. And now that libertarian ideas are more mainstream, maybe they're trying to find something, you know, edgier or more kind of offensive than that. That's sort of the only way that I see that transition happening. If anything, for me, it seems like the alt-right has more in common with the far left, right? Issue for issue. If you talk to a national socialist, right, the actual Nazis, and so I try not to use the word Nazi when it's not referring to an actual National Socialist, but there were National Socialists in Charlottesville. If you talk to those guys, issue for issue, they probably have more in common with the communists, right, than with your common Republican, right?
Wow.
They believe in free healthcare, right? You know, they believe in all sorts of free government.
Really? Wow.
Sure. And so I've been.
Yeah, they're just both collectivists, the right and the left, just different spectrums of collectivism.
Yeah, right. So right-wing collectivism is also, sort of a form of statism. When I've interviewed Richard Spencer actually in June, and when I interviewed Richard Spencer, he was being protested by an organization called the International Socialist Organization, which is another group kind of loosely affiliated with more tanky, or statist communists. And this was an event that didn't turn violent because the police in DC just locked down everything much more efficiently, right? So the two groups were separated and they didn't really get to each other. So there was no violence. And what that meant was we could actually talk to the white nationalist type people. Richard Spencer was able to speak to me, right, without, us being pepper sprayed or something. And when I interviewed him, I said, what do you think of basically these protesters out there, the International Socialist Organization? And his exact words were, the international socialism, I have no problem with that as long as it's done right.
Wow.
That's what Richard Spencer said. And so
now Spencer is the white nationalist who's pushing for sort of ethno pride, right?
Yeah, so he's a white nationalist who is probably credited with trying to bring white nationalism into academia, trying to bring the idea of like racial segregation, of separate states for different races into academia. That usually this is held by, these types of views are held by, rednecks, skinheads, right? There's these kind of stereotypes, but he is a good-looking, relatively younger man who wears nice suits and tries to make the alt-right look very, which he coined the term alt-right, look very kind of attractive. Again, dropping some of the kind of more like cringy Nazi elements in order to make the entire ideology seem more alluring. But the point I was making is that he basically is okay with socialism as long as it's done for white people, right? And he I've actually read on altright.com, right? He's written why Bernie Sanders is right about healthcare, right? So issue for issue in terms of free stuff, right, as we could call it, or services, the alt-right actually has a lot in common with the left. And recently,
it's a great point.
Tactically, they've been having more in common with the left. So one of the really, really interesting quotes actually from Christopher Cantwell, who, if people watch the Vice documentary about Charlottesville, they would be familiar with Cantwell, basically, as he was kind of a strong man kind of in Charlottesville, and now he's in jail, right? Cantwell gave a speech on June 25th, the same day that I did that interview with Spencer. And he said something to the effect of, the problem with the honest conservative is that they use books the way that the left uses force. So at least in his view, the problem with the right wingers is that they don't do street activism. They don't actually commonly do, street violence stuff. They don't do Antifa tactics. But his speech was about how they actually have to take on those tactics, how they have to essentially start acting like leftists in order to defeat leftists. It was an interesting and fairly provocative speech. And whether or not somebody thinks he was right, his prediction, his call for action was probably fairly accurate, right? Charlottesville was probably the first example of a full-blown riot in this decade that was that was kind of led by the right. And of course, the left attacked them, right? There's a lot of dispute over was the left responsible, was the right responsible? In my experience, honestly, both groups came to just beat the crap out of each other, right? Neither group initiated.
Right.
It just came to fight. But the right wing really took on tactically what the left does. They came.
What's interesting, I saw a film where the police were pushing these at least a group of protesters down these stairs and into like this whole group of Antifa thugs that were waiting on the street. And they had, I don't know which group it was, but anyways, one group was just walking down the street, and you had Antifa people and probably white, nationalist people, and they were just battling on the street. It was nuts.
Yeah, so it was really chaotic, and the tactical failure of the police, and sort of what you're describing there is, yeah, I mean, so basically the Lee Park, where the right wingers were permitted to be, is a little bit escalated. It's a few feet up, and it's kind of a small park, and all the left wingers were out on the street, sort of to the south end of that. And the problem is that the only entrance to the park was on that south side. So I've kind of said jokingly, right, the whole situation would have been peaceful if the right wingers could have been like airdropped, into the park. The problem is that, of course, they basically had to walk through the left to get in, and that's where most of the fighting was happening. Eventually, because it turned so violent, the police pushed all of the right wingers, and the tactical failure of the police is that they never really got in the middle of it. The police never actually stepped in the middle. The militias did, right? The constitutional militia groups did absolutely the most to keep the peace that day. There just weren't enough of them. The police never stepped in the middle. They could have evacuated them, the right wingers, like through the north side, but instead they pushed everybody away. They said, okay, the thing's canceled, so we're just going to push everybody out. And they basically pushed the right wingers into the left wingers, which exacerbated the fighting pretty severely. And also it lost the structure kind of that park versus the street around the park, which caused there to be violence throughout the city and of course led to the car crash.
I mean, we know that many leftist politicians have come out saying that they think Antifa is brave, and they think that or these protesters against Trump are brave, and we need them on the streets. Who was it? Loretta Lynch coming out and saying we need to get up on the streets and fight back. She made a statement about that, not about this Charlottesville, but about generally about protesting Trump. And we know that a lot of governors, leftist governors, have given orders for the police to stand down, especially when, for example, in Berkeley, when there were all those riots surrounding Ann Couture and Milo Yiannopoulos and all those things like this. The governor was telling them to stand down. They were letting these Antifa protesters burn down Berkeley buildings, throw stuff through windows, smash. It's totally nuts. So the left has definitely had a history, at least in different parts of the country, of telling the cops to stand down or not, make a full-blown situation about it. And we know that Charlottesville is very leftist leaning. Was there any overtone of that? Was there any information that you were able to gather on that?
The police in Charlottesville did very, very little, right? The only time when ultimately the, I guess I would say the situation was locked down was when Heather Hare died. They did have an armored vehicle basically lock off the street, which, to us at the time, it was unclear whether, could there be a second car, right? It was this a coordinated attack. Could another car come, fly into the crowd? Right. Right. So they did lock down that situation and bring out kind of the heavy artillery kind of then, but they were pretty much on the periphery the rest of the time up until the Hare attack.
It's amazing, because the other people are fighting, they're just watching them.
Yeah, so they were mostly just watching.
It's like Berkeley.
And I actually, so some people have speculated, as you seem to be more, implying that it's due to, city's leftism or kind of letting the left wing attack. The thing is, they're also letting the right wing attack, right? Somebody could argue that the police's lack of action allowed somebody, a white nationalist, to basically drive a car into people. I think it was more along the lines of the police didn't want to be blamed for exacerbating the violence, right? So if you ask an Antifa person, they might tell you that the police are complicit with fascism, right? So the way that you're sort of framing it, right, is, the police are under the thumb of the left-wing government, which there is in Charlottesville, right? So maybe the police, have to take sort of orders from that, or, whatever. the Antifa would tell you that that police are a tool of the fascist, right? So if you ended up with police guarding the white nationalists, and you have pictures in the news of them, batoning,
right, that would only confirm their right.
It would have
Attestations, right.
solidified their views of the police, and Charlottesville itself would be open to being sued. Jason Kessler is the organizer of Unite the Right, is doing a class action lawsuit now against the city of Charlottesville for essentially failing to protect them. Meanwhile, Charlottesville is suing basically everybody who showed up armed. In one lawsuit, they're attempting to sue individual, some right-wing characters, individual, some left-wing characters. There's a group called the Socialist Rifle Club and also Redneck Revolt are both left-wing militia groups that showed up, and they're suing those guys. They're suing the militias. Interestingly, one of the defendants listed is the National Socialist Movement. So literally they're attempting to sue Nazism, right? As if they can revive Hitler's body and have him answer for his crimes in Charlottesville, right? So I don't know how they intend to sue a movement, but in any event, the Charlottesville is trying to sue all these militia groups who were there, saying that it's their fault the violence happened. Kessler is trying to sue the city of Charlottesville for failing to kind of protect, but it's a lot easier to sue and get damages when someone actually does something, right? If Charlottesville sent out a bunch of cops and then maybe a cop shot somebody or a cop beat up somebody wrongly, right, or arrested someone when they shouldn't have, that's a lawsuit that can yield an actual dollar outcome, right? Kessler suing for a lack of protecting him, could he be successful? Maybe, but I think that just generally speaking, the legal, social, political, PR issues associated with doing nothing are probably a lot less than.
Oh, did we lose
3 people?
Okay, there you go. You're breaking up for it. There you go. There, now you're back in. You're back in.
In spite of the 3 people who died that day, the tragedy of that day, I remember the police very proudly proclaiming at a press conference, despite all of the injuries, police caused none of these injuries. I think that was something that seemed
right.
Today, and
kind of protect their institution. Right.
Part of their motivation for remaining fairly inactive.
Well, we definitely are grateful for law enforcement. We know that there's, of course, highly connected to, they're the lowest branch of government. I mean, so there are many times, yes, I mean, individuals will make problems, but of course, that's not law enforcement in general. That is, the problem. And most cops are trying to protect, the neighborhoods, trying to do the right thing, et cetera. It's unfortunate when the state gets so big and they become federalized, that becomes almost standing military over a nation or a state, and that becomes obviously something to be worried about. And so, for the work that you're doing, and of course, the journalism down there showing the actual photos and the video is really important to let people know, at least get a sort of point of view picture of what was going on, and not just listening to this or that view, but seeing for themselves, and then they can make their own view by, what you guys, what the journalists down there are releasing. Well, that is the last word for today on our broadcast this morning. We thank Ford Fischer for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. Yeah. And thank you for all the work that you're doing and going to these places to document what is happening. Everybody else for joining us this morning. We will see you tomorrow, 5 a.m. sharp on the King's Report. God bless, Godspeed, and may his kingdom come.
Justice about a